Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As I think every history podcaster can relate, part of the curse of this work is that even after we cover something in our podcast, new scholarship is constantly coming out that we would have loved to have had at our fingertips while we were in the midst of the subject. Sometimes, though, the stars align and new works are released in time for us to include the insight and perspective shared in new releases. As soon as this episode's guest reached out about his forthcoming book, I grew very excited as it directly relates to so much of what we've been covering in the main narrative series and will add to what we've already learned about James Madison, his approach and experience in foreign relations, and what it all meant for Americans in the early republic. My guest for this episode is Tyson Reeder, and his new book is called Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. Tyson teaches history at Brigham Young University and taught previously at the University of Virginia, where he was an editor of the papers of James Madison. He is the author of Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution, and editor of the Routledge History of U.S. Foreign Relations, in addition to numerous articles and book chapters. It was an absolute pleasure talking with Tyson, and I cannot thank him enough for his time and the insight that he provided. Likewise, Serpent in Eden is a fascinating read that I highly recommend, and I'll have more information about the book on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. But without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Tyson after this brief message.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
I am so grateful to be joined by a special guest today to talk about his new work, which is Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. And the author today is Tyson Reeder. Tyson, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
So before we were recording, we had a quick conversation about how this kind of feeds into some of the work that and some of the research that I've done for presidencies. And so as soon as we made contact and started setting up this conversation, I was like, oh yes, presidencies listeners are going to love this because it really gets at the heart of this idea of foreign meddling that's kind of been going through the narrative of presidential history that we've been discussing, but really taking it and having that be the focus. It really highlighted so much and brought out so much that you don't get otherwise in typical presidential history narratives.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. As I mentioned off air, yeah, I tell people that you'll find bits and pieces of my book scattered among other works. A lot of it is out there, but nobody's really taken it and strung it together in a single narrative. And I found that that was really important, and was telling me a lot of important things about early American history as I started to do that.
Absolutely. And to get us started, I was just wondering what drew you to write this book about the intersection of foreign affairs and politics in the early republic, and if you always envisioned James Madison as the linchpin to the subject, or if his role in it kind of bubbled to the surface during the course of your research. Presidencies listeners know we've been talking about James Madison for a bit and the role that he played in this story of American politics and presidential history. But I was just curious kind of where you started with this research.
So at the time I was at the University of Virginia. I was in the history department there, but my main shtick was as an editor for the papers of James Madison. And so the papers of James Madison brought me on specifically to work on James Madison's time as Secretary of State. I've done other work, other published works on early U.S. foreign relations, for example. And so I was working on the Secretary of State series for the papers of James Madison. And I just found that it was impossible to go through that series and not realize how much foreign meddling was at the forefront of Madison's mind, but also of many early politicians' minds during the age of the early republic. And the one that really got me interested, or a piece that really got me interested in this, was a long sort of tirade that James Madison sent to an ambassador or a diplomat in Spain. And he was complaining about the Spanish diplomat in the United States, and that Spanish diplomat was trying to interfere in early American politics in ways that was harming the Jefferson administration. And so Madison was, and Madison, of course, was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and so Madison was particularly miffed at this Spanish diplomat. So he writes about a 34-page tirade against this diplomat. He sends it to the U.S. diplomat in Madrid and basically says, take all of these arguments to the court at Madrid and basically tell them to get their diplomat out of here and send somebody else who we can work with. But in there, in that document, he just had Madison had what I found to be a very intriguing quote when he said something along the lines of, what would become of our democracy if we allowed foreign agents to come and meddle in U.S. elections? So when I found this, it was 2019. And so a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with that as the date of Donald Trump's first impeachment trial. And which, of course, was tied up intricately in the idea of foreign meddling and what Russia was doing, and then accusations of Donald Trump, of course, withholding funds from Ukraine to open an investigation into his political rival and so forth. And so this was so much in the public conversation. I found that particular document from James Madison intriguing. But then I just kept coming across other similar instances and Madison's concerns about them. And I thought to myself, well, geez, somebody needs to write a book about this. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess maybe I'm the guy. So I guess to answer your question, James Madison did introduce me to the subject, but I had originally actually not planned on using Madison as a central focus. But the more that I dug into the matter, and the more that I dug into the subject, I realized I really need to make James Madison the central focus for a couple of reasons. One is just because he was so much at the center of it all, from his time during the American Revolution, and then, of course, his leading role at the Constitutional Convention, a leader in Congress, Secretary of State, and then president. he was just at the center of these discussions for so much of his career, even more so than somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who, for instance, wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, more than George Washington, who, of course, dies in 1799, and so forth. So it just made sense to use James Madison's life as the arc through which I tell this story. And because, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, but because of of events that unfold during Madison's presidency, when he becomes implicated himself in accusations of foreign collusion, and in ways that very closely mirror the types of accusations leveled against Donald Trump in 2019. So I found the similarities just fascinating, and it made the War of 1812 kind of a nice end point, a bookend point for the project. And so it just became apparent that I needed to tell this story through the lens of James Madison.
Well, and you said a couple of things that, I'm really picking up on, first of all, and I think that's been one of the most surprising things to me in studying Madison in more detail, is just how intricately connected he is to so much for quite a few decades, in this development of the new nation, in the establishment of the early republic. And I think that's something that folks don't always appreciate about Madison. But then also, this idea of, the parallels, or where we can kind of see some similar themes to what's going on in the present day. I think that's been one thing that surprised me as I've been working through the presidency's narrative, is there is still so much that we can draw from and relate to in that time. And, while I think some may say, oh my gosh, we haven't learned anything in 200 years. It's also, we made it through crises before. We've got to figure out how to make it through these again. And why does this keep on becoming an issue? And what does it look like in the present day versus how it was in James Madison's time?
Right. I tell students and I tell others that history should be an important part of our conversations. Now, it's not going to lend definite answers to our problems. It's not going to close the debate on issues that we're facing today, but we certainly should draw on history to further the debate and to gain perspective on our debate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and as we're, getting to a point, we'll get to more of the foreign powers of the time that are involved with this narrative. But I did want to bring up another aspect of this that you really highlight in your work. From the time of the Revolution on through the War of 1812, you note how the native peoples of North America were involved in these struggles between the United States and the major European colonial powers on the continent. So I was wondering if you would mind talking about how American leaders viewed the role of the native nations in these struggles, and was there a difference in how the European powers approached them versus the U.S.?
Yeah, so the story that I'm telling is a kind of a cycle, and I call it a destructive symbiosis between foreign meddling and partisan politics, right? And that the two are feeding off of each other in really destructive ways, in really harmful ways, I think, for U.S. democracy. So there's a fear about foreign powers. There's also a fear that you have internal dissenters. And often partisans are going to equate their partisan opponents with those internal dissenters. But what Americans really fear, they essentially believe we can deal with foreign powers. That's a manageable problem. We can deal with internal dissenters. That's a manageable problem. But what happens when foreign powers and internal dissenters seem to start to team up in ways that are really that we see as really detrimental? And so there's a pervasive fear of Native Americans. Why? Because for Americans, Native Americans partake in both characteristics. They're a foreign power, and yet Americans view them at the same time as a subject dependency. And so they're this, what a lot of Americans see as a really dangerous cross between the two, that they're at the same time a harmful foreign power and an internal disloyal dissenter. And eventually the main power that they're worried about is a confederacy between Native Americans in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley and British Canada. And so eventually Americans are going to look at this confederacy, and at least Americans in James Madison's strain of thinking are going to start to pair Native Americans with the British and with Federalists, and say Native Americans are part of a three-legged stool of dangerous actors in American politics, and they're part of this confederacy, again supported by Federalists and really undergirded by the British, that is going to be destructive to our republic. And so that's how American leaders view Native Americans. Now, Europeans are going to view Native Americans more in terms of actual allies in a sort of independent and sovereign sense, and yet junior allies. And so this is true across the spectrum, not just with Britain, but we see this with Spain and with France also, that at certain times European powers are going to ally with Native Americans in order to advance their interests in North America. And what that looks like from an American perspective is you may have Native Americans who are allied with the British, and then you have Native Americans who are allied with the Spanish, who are allied with France against the British, but everybody seems to be against the United States. That's from an American perspective. Even our allies, France, and this is actually true. I mean, we have internal memos essentially from French cabinets and so forth that essentially are saying, we don't care much whether the United States lives or dies, exists, dissolves, whatever. Really what we want is the United States to be a pawn in our game against the British. And Americans feel that. And so there's a strong feeling among Americans that Native Americans are an intricate part of, that they have the potential of just being a plaything of European politics in North America.
Yeah, you really get the sense at some points that from the European perspective that Native Americans, as well as the United States and even sections of the United States, they're just viewing them as chess pieces on a board and trying to play them against one another in order to gain an advantage over another European power.
Right. Yeah. And I hope that my book helps bring that out, that it's hard to imagine that world in a day when the United States is the global superpower. It's hard to imagine the world where the United States is reacting to global events rather than leading global events.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And I think your book does a great job of highlighting that in kind of the larger sense, but then also getting to some of these individuals who are involved and seeing how these global events and these external politics are influencing what they're thinking of in terms of crafting the nation. And I think that's one reason Madison is a great person to focus in on with this subject, because you wrote in your book about Madison's, quote, lifelong struggle to square civil liberty with national security. And I imagine folks know more about Madison's efforts with the former rather than the latter, thinking of the Bill of Rights. But would you mind talking more about this balance that Madison tried to achieve during his career on the public stage, and whether he was ever really able to reconcile the two?
Right. So for Madison, we do usually think of him as sort of the civil liberty guy, like you said, because he gives us the Bill of Rights. He gives us Federalist Number 10, which usually we see as Madison's ingenious idea about how we're going to solve the problem between power and liberty, right? Government power versus preserving the liberty of the people. And it has to do with a multiplicity of parties, that you won't get a tyranny of the majority, and so forth, and how a republic is going to exist across a broad space, a broad geographic scope. So we think of Madison as the civil liberty guy. The more I dove into this, I think that Madison was intricately concerned about national security in ways that I don't think that he has been recognized for. Usually when historians, constitutional scholars, political scientists, usually when they think about the Constitution and the founding and national security, they're thinking George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. And Madison is usually left out of that mix. But the more I looked at this, the more I was convinced Madison, the main problem for Madison is how do you create a nation that can protect against foreign meddling and these foreign intrigues? Well, you have to strengthen the nation. You have to strengthen federal power. But what happens when you strengthen federal power? You just might endanger liberty. So how do you beef up national security without endangering civil liberty? And I think that when we view Federalist 10 in that light, we get a whole new perspective on Federalist 10. And what he's going to say is it's okay. We can strengthen the nation against foreign powers. Because if you look back in history, which Madison did, Madison looks back in history at all of these confederacies of the past. And what he's going to see is a constant through line that these confederacies eventually are going to face internal divisions, and then some foreign power is going to come in and swoop in and usurp their sovereignty. And Madison's convinced that's what he's seeing happen to the United States. And so he says, if we want to maintain our sovereignty, we have to join together in a stronger nation. And it's okay. We can do that because a republic actually works better across a vast geographic scope, because you'll have so many different competing interests that no single group can rise to some sort of tyrannical majority. And so the idea of the tyranny of the majority, I think, is intricately related in Madison's mind to the idea of national security. And part of my evidence for that is if you just stop at Federalist number 10, then yeah, maybe you're still seeing Madison as solely the civil liberties guy. But it's the subsequent Federalist Papers that he writes that he really lays out this history for Americans. And it's something that he did also in the Constitutional Convention and in the run-up to the Constitutional Convention. He's writing George Washington. He's writing Thomas Jefferson. The main the main specter in Madison's mind is Philip of Macedon, or Philip of Macedonia, who he says when Greeks when Greek confederacies started to bicker among themselves, all of a sudden Philip of Macedonia comes in and usurps Greek sovereignty. And he brings this up again and again and again. And so Madison is deeply concerned that this is happening under the Articles of Confederation. So that's why he wants to bring the Constitutional Convention together to deal with this issue, to say, how do we strengthen the government and strengthen our bonds and strengthen our ties to each other in ways that we don't create a government so powerful that it harms liberty, but we do create a powerful bond amongst ourselves and create a strong enough government that it can withstand foreign meddling. And, I don't know that he ever does reconcile the two, frankly. As we go through the book, he maintains a strong commitment to civil liberty, but I think the rest of his life he sees these two in tension. Civil liberty versus national security, and the trick, the dance is to figure out the proper balance between the two.
Well, and you can see in the course of his career where him, and especially in his collaboration with Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party, that they're trying to come up with different ways, different approaches to national security. And you see that in the Embargo Act. You see that in the Non-Importation Act. You see these attempts to use economics to secure the nation from this foreign influence and meddling. And it's something, it's not an idea that ends with Jefferson and Madison. We still have that as part of our foreign affairs and foreign politics and foreign viewpoints today. And it's just interesting, but because it's trying to make that balance. But as you know, the embargo, of course, doesn't work. These economic coercions don't work at the time. It's not necessarily that it was a bad approach. It could work, but just not then. And just the timing didn't work out.
Well, right, and Madison. So we usually think of the embargo as Jefferson's. We call it like the Jefferson embargo, and but the embargo was Madison's baby. It was his brainchild, and this is what Madison had wanted for a long, long time. In fact, in his very first speech in the new Congress after the Constitution is created and the first federal Congress is convened. In the first debate, he introduces what we call discriminatory duties against Britain. In other words, he wanted the Constitution because he wanted commercial warfare with Britain. He said, Britain is treating us unfairly. And we can't respond without the Constitution, without the unity that comes from the Constitution. We can't respond as a united nation against Britain. And so he's been thinking about this for decades by the time we get to the embargo. And so he finally gets what he wants in the embargo. Now, the embargo, like you said, is a complete disaster. It's a disaster economically. It's a disaster politically. And so it eventually is repealed, much to Madison's chagrin. Madison maintains faith in the embargo even after it's repealed. But it is repealed right before he takes office as president. But he's going to continue to use that. He maintains his faith in economic coercion, which, oddly enough, not to get too far ahead of ourselves in where we are in the book, but oddly enough, when we get up to the War of 1812, he's going to succeed. Britain has these onerous orders in council that are disrupting U.S. commerce as part of its war with Napoleon. And eventually they announce that they are repealing those orders in council, but it's 2 months too late. The United States, at Madison's behest, has declared war on Britain before Madison finds out that that Britain has repealed these orders in council. And so, one of the most interesting, ahistorical hypotheticals is to imagine what happens if Madison waits 2 months to declare war and learns that Britain has repealed the orders in council. Because once war starts, Madison's not turning back. Once war starts, Madison is going to say, well, that's all well and good that you repealed the orders in council. What we really want you to do, though, is to stop pressing Americans into the British service, which has a long, complex history. But so he, even after he learns, he doesn't just say, oh, okay, never mind, then we're not at war anymore. He presses forward. But had he learned that 2 months, had he learned that they were repealing that 2 months earlier, and the United States never declares war, it would be interesting to see where history might have gone. But hence, alas, that's a hypothetical that we'll never know.
Absolutely. And it's so fascinating to study, and especially this idea, this balance of trying to square civil liberty with national security. And you see this come up time and again in Madison's career. And that's one thing with Madison. At times, he could be rather consistent with his views on foreign powers and our approach to foreign relations. But you did note one instance in particular where he seemed to be at odds with his ideals. And you had mentioned earlier the Spanish minister to the U.S., Araujo, who tried to use the press to exert influence. And we saw this in a couple of instances, but this one Madison was really involved with, because you wrote, quote, Araujo caught Madison in a war with his own ideology. Before his party took power, Madison had chastised Federalists for restricting the free press and trying to deny constitutional rights to foreigners. But in this instance, Madison was kind of going against himself. So I was wanting to see if you see this as a pronounced shift in Madison's approach to foreign affairs, or were incidents like this more isolated?
Yeah, well, I think you definitely do. So part of a lot of my focus on the book is how do we understand American sovereignty, or I should say sovereignty in America? Because most people would agree with Madison when Madison wrote that sovereignty lies with the people, right? That sovereignty in the United States lies with the people, not the government. The government can exercise power, but ultimate sovereignty is based in the people. But as obvious as that sounds to us now, Americans weren't quite sure. And when a party was in power, they were pretty sure that the government was sovereign and that the people should defer to the government. And that's what drove Madison nuts about the Federalists. That's why he hated the Alien and Sedition Acts, because they suggested, particularly the Sedition Act, suggests that the government is sovereign and the people have no business attacking the government or finding fault with the government. And so he is irate with the Federalists after 1798 and the Sedition Act, when he's out of power and when the Democratic Republicans are out of power. Well, then we skip forward 2 years later, and all of a sudden Madison is holding executive power. And Irujo is a very interesting case to me, because Irujo is essentially going to call out the U.S. government, and Madison in particular, for wanting to have this both ways. What Irujo starts to do, it's a bit of a long and complicated history about a Spanish and American tussle over West Florida along the Gulf Coast. And land there and who that land belongs to and so forth. But what Irujo starts to do is he starts to make his case and Spain's case in American newspapers. And that's when Madison gets really upset. This is that 34-page, I don't know what you call it, a memo, a tirade, that he writes to the U.S. diplomat in Spain. And so he's just irate with Irujo. How dare Irujo start to meddle with the people and try to turn the people against the government? He's trying to subvert the government, right? Well, Irujo's going to say, well, no, because you can't have it both ways. Are the people sovereign or not? If the people are sovereign, then I, as a foreign minister, am just essentially negotiating with the sovereign of the country. And if the people end up agreeing with me and they kick you out of office, you're just an administrator. You're not the sovereign. And so this is where Madison starts to rethink some of his ideas. The answer seemed clear for Madison when the Federalists were in power. Certainly the people are sovereign. And he didn't mind all that much when foreign ministers were meddling in U.S. politics trying to get Federalists out of power. Now Madison holds executive power. Again, at this point, he's Secretary of State and Jefferson is president, but he's in an executive office. So Madison has executive power and his party has executive power. And all of a sudden, these questions are a lot more muddy for him. Well, what happens when it seems like your political foes are making common cause with who you see as a geopolitical foe? All of a sudden, they don't look just like dissenters. They look like traitors to some extent, or at least disloyal to some degree. And so I think that's what really gets us to the heart of this book and the problems even still that we face today is that we have these civil liberties that we need to square with national security. But a republic is uniquely exposed to some of these problems because we protect things like a free press. In our day, we protect things like free Twitter, for example, that foreign governments can exploit to meddle in politics. And so the question becomes, how do you stop that meddling without suppressing some of these liberties, without suppressing elections every 4 years? I mean, that's a major incentive for foreign governments, both in Madison's time and in our time. It's a major incentive to elections every 2 years and every 4 years for the presidency, of course, that a government, that foreign governments can come in and say, we just need to get these people kicked out of power and hopefully get other people in power. And they do half our job for us by giving Americans the ability to kick these people out of power every so often. And so it's a major conundrum for republics that we continue to struggle with.
Absolutely. And one thing that you throw into the mix in your book, as you're talking about media and the role that it played in that time, and to your point, still plays and is still a delicate balance in the present day, also the rumor mill. This idea, and it's kind of woven into the media, but then also just in public discourse in general. And you noted numerous times in your work how rumors would enter into the public consciousness and potentially impact sentiment in American policy discourse. And one that in particular caught my attention was this false rumor that the French minister to the U.S., Edmond Charles Genet, had assassinated Washington in late 1793. And, it's surreal for us to think about. But yeah, at the time that, and the nature of the media at the time, it would take time to disprove that if this rumor was circulating. So I was wondering, in examining some of these rather extreme rumors that popped up at the time, what do you think this may tell us about the anxieties present in the early republic?
So to sort of fill anybody in who's not quite familiar, Genet comes over as a as a diplomat from France, and by this time a war has broken out between revolutionary France and Britain, and Genet essentially comes over to the United States to cash in France's favor during the American Revolution and to call the United States to aid in their alliance that they created during that revolution. Now, they never really expected the United States to go to war with Britain, but they did expect some favors out of this alliance. And instead, George Washington declares neutrality. And Genet is just befuddled. And it's actually Genet. Genet is sort of a precursor for Irujo. Genet is going to really be the first to say, no, the people are sovereign. So I don't care what Washington says. Washington is one person in one branch of the government amidst, a 3-branch government compiled with on top of state governments. There are all sorts of sovereignties in the United States. And I'm taking my case to the sovereign people. And so Genet is really the first to start to try to drum up public opinion against the U.S. government. He's really the first diplomat that tries to do that in a major way. And he makes Washington incredibly upset, and their relationship gets strained. Even Jefferson, who is sympathetic to the French cause and to Genet's mission, he basically writes Madison a couple of times and others saying, we have to dump this guy Genet. He's not doing our party any favors. And to the point that, like you said, this rumor mill heats up. And there's a fellow in Concord, New Hampshire, who writes that, who hears a rumor that Genet has murdered Washington. So we have the French diplomat murdering Washington, and then this writer, when he learns that it's not true, he doesn't just say, "Oh, good, it's not true." He has somebody that he wants to blame, and he wants to blame Federalists. And what he assumes is that that this is sort of an intricate plot of Federalists to drum up discontent with Genet and his mission. And so he's going to call Federalists into question and essentially say those dirty, rotten scoundrels are sending these rumors around in an attempt to disrupt our relations with France and to ruin Genet's reputation and so forth. So I think, to your question, what do we learn from this? Well, my book isn't just about foreign meddling. It's about how Americans react to foreign meddling and what happens when you do get foreign meddling, when you get the Genets and the Arujos, and we haven't really talked about them, but the Adays and the Fauchets and the George Hammonds from Britain, all of these people are meddling in U.S. politics. But when you get this, Americans don't unite in distrust against foreign governments. They actually become divided against each other, and they do start to view each other suspiciously. And that suspicion only creates a greater chasm for foreign governments to come in and do more meddling. So that's why I call this a destructive symbiosis between foreign meddling and partisan politics. So this particular person with this particular rumor about Washington's death at the hands of Genet, I find really telling. That instead of just breathing a sigh of relief and saying, well, that wasn't true, he has somebody he wants to blame, and he's not blaming France. He's blaming Federalists. He's blaming his neighbors, essentially, on the other side of the political aisle.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to emphasize here, Tyson, is that, it's one thing for these foreign actors to be trying to influence. It's another in how people react and actually make it successful and help to generate more of it, because if it's successful once, folks are going to try it even more, and that's an important part of this.
Right. And I think that also is how I view Madison, that Madison is very good at diagnosing this problem.
Mm-hmm.
He's less good at recognizing his own contributions to the problem. And so I think Madison is a stand-in for many partisans at the time and today who can easily recognize partisanship in their political opponents and recognize it in themselves less easily. And I think that the ability to recognize our own priors is really important in bringing our national conversation to a point that is productive rather than destructive.
Absolutely. Well, and you had listed off a good number of foreign diplomats that, unfortunately, I could sit here and talk about them for hours, but I'm not going to hold you for hours.
Yeah.
I did.
I could as well, but yeah, your audience might start turning off their phones.
I promised you that I was only really going to ask you about one at this point, and it's one that we've talked about in the presidency's narrative. We haven't really been able to focus in as much on him, but since especially that he came to the U.S., had some time here, and then went back to France and rose to prominence, I had to ask about Talleyrand. And I was wondering if you would mind sharing with the audience more about Talleyrand's time in the U.S. and what impact this had on his later diplomatic career and his relationship with American envoys once he became the French foreign minister.
Right. Yeah. So Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, he's an interesting fellow. He's a moderate revolutionary in the early days of the French Revolution. And he's instrumental in forming the Constituent Assembly in France and creating a constitutional monarchy in France. Well, once the French Revolution starts to become more radical, he starts to look less like a moderate and more like a traitor. So he is exiled from France. He goes to London for a time. And then from London, he comes to Philadelphia, and he spends a lot of time in Philadelphia. And when he arrives, the French diplomat in the United States, Joseph Fauchet, views him with great suspicion. Fauchet is a Jacobin through and through. So he's on the more radical end of the French Revolution. And so anybody who was as moderate as Talleyrand is going to seem suspicious to Fauchet. And so when Talleyrand comes to the United States, Talleyrand is also going to strike up a friendship with Hamilton, with Alexander Hamilton. Well, that's not going to do anything to dampen Fauché's suspicions of him. Anybody that's that chummy with somebody who loves Britain as much as Hamilton must be some sort of French traitor. But really, like many other exiles, French exiles who end up in Philadelphia, Fauché really just wants to return to a calmer, more sane France. He doesn't come with any sort of secret orders from London. In fact, London, the British government basically said, you need to leave London or else we're going to deport you to France and you'll probably lose your head. So that's why he comes ends up coming to Philadelphia. But in his time here, he gets an intricate look at U.S. politics. And so he's going to learn about these growing differences between U.S. political parties, and he's going to learn how to use them so that when France does, I don't know if you can say calm down because Napoleon's going to rise to power, but when Talleyrand's style of politician is back in favor in France, he'll return to France and eventually will climb the ladder until he's the French foreign minister under Napoleon. And he takes these lessons with him. One, again, is how that you can use U.S. parties against each other for your own benefit. And he's going to learn the importance of Louisiana to geopolitics and to geostrategy in North America. And so Talleyrand is going to call essentially for a renewed empire in North America, which is something that Napoleon is already contemplating. And when Talleyrand returns, before that happens, though, we should actually return to what we, of course, now call the XYZ affair, because here the United States is now looking like it's going to be entering into what we now call the quasi-war with France. And John Adams wants to tone down the temperature, bring down the temperature with France. And so he's going to try peace first, and he's going to send a peace delegation to France. Well, Talleyrand, though, he's going to exact a bribe from these three American negotiators before he's even willing to talk to them. In fact, he doesn't talk to them. He doesn't request the bribe. He sends fixers to request the bribe. These are the guys that become known as X, Y, and Z, for example. And so he won't even talk to them until they basically pay him a personal bribe. And this is going to create a lot of political disharmony, both within the delegation, because you have two Federalists and a person who eventually will basically come down on the side of a moderate Republican or a moderate Democratic Republican. So they start to argue amongst themselves what they should do. And but once word of all of this gets out in the United States, it's only going to exacerbate U.S. politics. Adams is going to release the documents associated with this meeting to Congress. That blows Madison's cap a little bit. He attacks Adams for what I call the curious sin of being too transparent. And so Madison thinks he knows what's going on here. When Adams releases these documents that really embarrass France, that basically say, okay, look, France has no interest in peace, therefore the only alternative is war, Madison thinks he knows what's going on with Adams. And instead of, again, like I said, instead of being suspicious of what's happening in France, Madison is going to essentially say that Adams is intentionally trying. He released these documents intentionally to get Congress to want to go to war with France. He overlooks the fact that Adams did something very similar with British documents earlier on. It's a less known controversy, and we probably don't have time to get into it here. But Adams really does do the same thing on the British side. So Adams, I think, is really just trying to truly be transparent. But in the heat of politics, Madison isn't going to see it that way. Now, he does say, essentially, how could Talleyrand be so stupid? He knows about U.S. politics. He knows that exacting a bribe is going to absolutely infuriate Federalists, and that's only going to lead to war with France. So he does question Talleyrand's role in all of this, but Madison is really irate with Adams and with Federalists as the United States enters war with France. And so again, with Talleyrand, we just see another example of ways that foreign powers are able to manipulate U.S. politics, and that Americans, rather than uniting in their ire against whatever foreign nation is meddling in their politics, instead they remain more suspicious of each other than they are of foreign meddling.
And it's interesting because this kind of brings up, and you had alluded to some of this earlier, because fast forward about a decade or so and you get into the Madison presidency, and you have the president releasing foreign documents to try and push towards war. And it's beyond just being a fascinating tale of intrigue and this con game. I was wondering, Tyson, what do you think the Henry Letters incident tells us about that particular time in history when it occurred?
Right. So yeah, this is really fascinating. This is what I was alluding to earlier about the parallels that we actually saw with the first Trump impeachment. So what happens is in 1808, there's a British spy who comes, and we've talked about the embargo that's occurring at the time, the U.S. embargo on foreign trade. And this British spy comes. He sent particularly, again, with instructions, specific instructions to figure out where the parties stand. So foreign governments know, and they're thinking very clearly and explicitly and openly, well, not openly in terms of what they're telling the United States, but amongst each other, that they want to know how they can manipulate the political parties for their benefit. So they send a couple of spies, actually. One is John Howe, and John Howe sends back a lot of he sends back advice that basically says, you know what, just suffer through the embargo. To the British government, don't change a thing, because what's going to happen is the embargo is going to ruin Jefferson before it ruins our commerce. So don't change a thing, and then Republicans will be out of power. Well, Republicans do repeal the embargo, and Madison does become president. So that doesn't, so his wishes aren't exactly fulfilled. But another spy that they send is going to be this fellow named John Henry. And John Henry is sent with the mission to figure out if Federalists and their stronghold of New England might consider seceding from the United States and joining the British in an alliance against France. So Henry has a lot of conversations with Federalists, and the conversations end up pretty innocuous. Nobody really says anything explicit, and nothing explicitly traitorous. It turns out Henry gets a paltry compensation for his services. So he goes to London and he tries to get at least some sort of government appointment for his services. Nothing pans out. So he's embittered now against the British government. And he decides to return to the United States, where his daughters had been living, actually. And so he's just going to return to the United States. But on the ship ride back, he runs into a French con artist, a really colorful fellow named Paul-Émile Soubiran. And Soubiran he's just scoundrelly enough that he recognizes that he can manipulate John Henry here. And so Soubiran starts to masquerade as a French count, somebody who's really influential, but has been exiled from Napoleon's France. And he convinces Henry to join with him, and together they're going to sell Henry's correspondence and convince President Madison that you have traitorous Federalists who are colluding with Britain. And so they do just that. And Madison buys it hook, line, and sinker. And literally buys it. He purchases these documents for $50,000. To put that in perspective, he could have purchased a warship for about that same amount of money. He spends the entire Secret Service fund, not Secret Service as we know it today, but basically America's entire espionage fund on these documents. Convinced. I truly don't think that it's anything nefarious on Madison. It's maybe a nefarious act, but it's not that he's acting maliciously. It's that Madison now lives in a world, and has lived in a world for decades, where he can only see Federalists as somehow fundamentally corrupt or criminal. So when somebody comes to him and says, we have documents that prove that Federalists are corrupt or criminal, he's going to buy it. He believes fundamentally that that has to be the case. And so he purchases these documents, and it turns out that sure, they show some British conniving, but nothing criminal on the part of Federalists. He tries to cover it up. He actually tries to make it look like like John Henry gave him the documents rather than him spending this load of public money on the documents. But word leaks out. And so Federalists are going to rake Madison across the coals for this, and in essence accuse the president. And this is in 1812. It's an election year. It's Madison's reelection. So they're going to accuse President Madison of misusing public money to enhance his own political benefit in an election year. Well, if you just say that sentence, that's exactly the first Trump impeachment, like I said. So I found this incredibly, just really intriguing, a really intriguing parallel. And I think that it shows a culmination of the world that Madison lives in. Now Madison is going to remain convinced that Federalists actually are corrupt. And if he just got his hands on the right documents, that he could prove that. But he doesn't have he doesn't have those documents. And so the most that he can do is go and ask Congress for war. And he's going to say, well, he can't say much about Federalist collusion because he doesn't have proof of that. But he is going to say, do you see what Britain is trying to do? They're trying to sever part of our union. And really the only answer is war. And that's not to say that the War of 1812 was fought over this Henry episode. It wasn't. There were a lot of background issues. But that's going to be... I view this as an epitome or a sort of culmination of this world that Madison has lived in, that he sees war as the only remedy to this dangerous combination between foreign meddling and who he sees as disloyal internal dissidents. And so, in answer to Madison's questions during the Constitutional Convention, can the United States create a government that can protect against foreign meddling and at the same time protect civil liberty? And can a democracy exist through this? Madison wages the very war that almost proved that it couldn't. The United States Capitol, of course, is burned during the War of 1812. And the United States, and with that, maybe almost symbolically, metaphorically, the national charters were almost burned as well. It was actually only by sort of a stroke of luck that a secretary in the State Department decided to pack up the engrossed copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States and actually move them out. Literally the U.S. charters, the founding charters, were almost burned with the Capitol, just as a sort of symbol of how close this destructive cycle brought Americans to the brink of collapse.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I think that's an important part of this, is that this was still an unusual form of government. This was trying something new. And I think that plays into some of this and some of the anxiety that goes around this and the impact of foreign influence. And, at one point in your book, you paraphrase Alexander Hamilton's viewpoint as follows, quote, "In European monarchies, foreign bribes might buy a few courtiers. In a republic that allowed free political discourse, foreign interference could turn a nation against itself." And I think this idea of Madison kind of having this idea in mind and having this worldview in mind, and when somebody presents him evidence of it on a silver platter, and he's not going to look at it too hard, he's going to say, "Oh yeah, this is it." And so this idea, this difference between the type of influence in monarchies versus republics, and, of course, in the modern era, we have more republics than we do really true monarchies as they had back in that day. But I was wondering if could you share some more about this contrast between the two and whether you feel that this still holds true today, and especially in republics. And, of course, this relates to the issues in politics in the modern day.
Right. Yeah. So I think that it is still a conundrum that we face, kind of as we were mentioning earlier. What happens? I mean, a republic it needs a free press. It needs freedom of speech. It needs to be able to rotate through leaders. It needs elections. It needs all of these things for it to be a republic, at least any sort of recognizable, viable republic. And yet it's those very things that do make them uniquely susceptible to foreign meddling. And so you do get Madison and Hamilton, both with a different view for their republic. As you mentioned, this is an experiment, and nobody knows what this experiment is supposed to look like. And they have different ideas about what it should look like. And so it feels like so much is at stake. During the Genet affair, Jefferson said that he was protecting human liberty. Human liberty. I mean, so we're not just for Jefferson, for Madison, for Hamilton, we're not just talking about the semantics of foreign policy. They see human liberty at stake. And how do you protect that? And they did, and Madison and Hamilton are going to disagree about how to protect that and about what the government should look like to protect that. And so, but when human liberty is at stake, those are high stakes. And so you're going to be suspicious of anybody that you see as contrary or counter to your vision of what the nation should look like. And so that heightens the political temperature. And then that's going to invite a lot of this foreign meddling. Now, I do think at the same time and in the same breath that had Madison, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson had a lot of these actors recognized that actually democracies can also be very insulated from foreign meddling, that they might not have felt so much at stake, and therefore they might not have reinforced this destructive cycle. A democracy can be very difficult. In some ways, it's easier for foreign governments to meddle in a monarchy. You find the right foreign minister to bribe, and you can change the entire opinion of the court. Well, you can't bribe half a nation in a democracy. And so democracies can actually be very unwieldy. Where I think we run into trouble, and where early America ran into trouble, is that when the country becomes polarized between two visions, and not even really between two visions, but really essentially between two parties. When the country becomes polarized between two parties, then it becomes much easier for a foreign government to exploit these weaknesses of a democracy, like its free press and like freedom of speech, because all you have to do, rather than trying to wrangle a bunch of different ideas and opinions in different directions, if you can just pit one half of the country against another and convince one half that half of the country that the other half is somehow corrupt or evil, then a lot of your work is already done. And now you just need to exploit the free press and exploit some of these freedoms to continue to turn up the temperature on that polarization. And so that polarized electorate makes foreign meddling much easier.
Well, and you brought up a point that I wanted to circle back around as we wrap up our conversation, this idea of our conception of the nation, our conception of the United States and America, because, towards the end of your work, you discussed contemporary political cartoons, and in particular, the shift from the personification of the United States by the figure known as Columbia to what we now know of as Uncle Sam. And so I was wondering if you would mind elaborating more about this with our audience and what this tells us about how the American public saw the nation in the aftermath of the War of 1812.
Yeah, so until the War of 1812, the caricature most used to symbolize the United States, like John Bull is the symbol of Britain. Columbia symbolizes the United States, a woman, and in particular at this time in U.S. history, a white woman. So somebody who's virtuous but fragile, who needs protecting. After the War of 1812, and initially, the initial images of Uncle Sam are almost humorous. That Uncle Sam initially starts out as sort of a bungling idiot And it's largely a caricature of that originates with Federalists who don't like the War of 1812. And so they're showing Uncle Sam as this bungling idiot who's mucking up the war effort and so forth. And so that shows this a constant refrain that the Republic is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to foreign powers. It's vulnerable to internal dissension. It's a vulnerable nation. Then we start to see the development of Uncle Sam later on as the United States enters its more imperial age and starts to expand westward and starts to acquire dominions overseas and the Philippines and so forth. Then we all of a sudden start to see Uncle Sam develop into the iconic image from World War I that I want you for the U.S. Army, right? That he's bold, he's assertive, and so. But the reason that I bring those up at the end of my book is I think that it is worth bearing in mind the origins of Uncle Sam, of a vulnerable democracy. And yet after the War of 1812, we start to see the development of Uncle Sam and another image that's kind of gone by the wayside is Brother Jonathan, that Americans are starting to feel a stronger sense of their strength. And so I think that when we want to protect democracy, but being convinced that democracy is on the brink of collapse all the time also heats up our political temperatures. And so I think we need to develop this healthy balance between, the Uncle Sam image and the Columbia image, right? We are trying to protect a vulnerable democracy, and yet we can have faith in the strength of our institutions. And I think that if we can develop that mindset, that we won't feel like we have our hand over the panic button all the time, and we won't see our political foes, people who disagree with us about the direction of the country, we won't see them as somehow fundamentally corrupt or they may dissent from our idea of the nation, but that does not mean they're trying to subvert the nation.
Well, and Tyson, I hope that this conversation, and once folks finish listening to this episode and go and pick up your book, I hope that helps them to reflect on this idea and a good way to move forward. And like you said, not always feeling like we're right at the panic stage, that panic button, that we can truly move forward, just as we see in history. We see examples of Americans doing just that. So thank you so much. That's a wonderful point to wrap up our conversation on.
Thank you, Jerry. I've really enjoyed this.
Likewise, wonderful conversation. I cannot thank you enough for being here. And for our audience, the book is Serpent in Eden: Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. I'll have a link on the page for this episode. I'll also be sharing information on my social media, so be sure to check that out. Tyson, thank you so much again for your time and the insight that you provided.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much again to Tyson Reeder for joining me for this episode to discuss his book, Serpent in Eden: Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. We could have gone on for much longer about all that Tyson covered in his book, but I'll leave it to you to pick up a copy and check it out for yourself, as I have no doubt that you'll enjoy the read, as I did. I'll have a link to more information on the book on my website, Presidencies Podcast, that's all one word, .com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to information about all the U.S. presidents, and information about how you, yes, you, dear listener, can support the work of the Presidencies Podcast. Whether you sign up as a patron, fulfill one of the books on my research wish list, or leave a rating and review, I cannot thank you enough for your support in this labor of love. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to send me an email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on social media. I'm available at Mastodon, Blue Sky, and Facebook as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads at Presidencies Podcast, all one word. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.